In season 2 of the Best of Health podcast, I am shining a spotlight on all of the life stages of women's health, from menarche to post-menopause. Topics covered will range literally from head to toe, addressing migraines to vaginal health and everything in between. My conversations are going to be with leading experts in their field, and we will tap into a deep well of knowledge and uncover an array of clinical pearls which promise to be an illuminating and helpful support to your personal health journey. So grab a cuppa and join me this autumn for the Best of Health Season 2, Women's Health Uncovered. So welcome back to the Best of Health podcast Season 2, and I'm kicking off today talking to the wonderful Tracey Randell, who is a really dear friend of mine and is probably one of the most esteemed practitioners, functional medicine practitioners in the UK. And we are going to be talking about the role of gut health and diving into Sibo. And if that doesn't mean anything to you, it will do by the end of this podcast. So stay tuned. And the interaction of histamine with our hormones. Just to give you a little bit of background about my dear friend, she is a fully qualified nutritional therapist and has been running her own very busy practice, IBS clinics, for over 10 years now. And she is also a fully certified functional medicine practitioner. So she integrates functional medicine and weaves that sort of ethos throughout all of her patient history. And she rolls that out within her clinic as well through her other practitioners. And she has a particular interest in gut health being sort of the central part to overall health. And I would classify her as the queen, the UK queen of Sibo and IBS and gut health. And Tracey and I have spent many years traveling conferences across the globe and so sharing bathrooms and bedrooms and connecting dots around sort of biochemistry. So it is with absolute joy that I welcome you, Tracey, to the podcast. And can't wait to talk to you and share your mountain of knowledge with our listeners. Welcome.
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you for the intro. I don't think I could have done a better job if I'd written it myself.
Well, it's all true. It's all true. So, Tracey, could you, as we sort of kick off this season, talk very much with a sort of a focus around women's health, and sort of we know that that gut health has a profound impact across our hormonal system, and vice versa. So could you maybe in your words give me a little bit of background about how when you're taking a case history, what might alert you if a woman comes into clinic and feels that this is my hormones, my hormones are in a mess, which is a dialogue that we hear a lot. What type of maybe symptoms or elements from their case history might alert you to sort of use or investigate sort of gut health as a bit of as a leverage point to improve some of their symptoms?
Okay, well, as you might expect, because I'm so gut focused, I'm all about the bowels. So very early on, I'm going to be asking questions around, are you able to achieve a bowel movement every day? So a typical scenario that I see very often is people are very constipated. So someone might say, oh, well, I go regularly. And I'll say, okay, so every day? Well, no, every 3 or 4 days. And that's what they term as being regular. So then I will normally point out that I actually don't think that's terribly regular at all. And often then they'll say, well, I wasn't always this way. I used to be the other way. So then we start talking about, okay, so tell me also, are you experiencing bloating, distension, acid reflux? Are you gassy, flatulent? And you kind of build a picture. Normally there's a few giggles at this point, and then the lady will say, well, yes, I'm afraid there's rather too much going on. Sometimes I look 6 months pregnant, and I'm starting to eye up elasticated waist trousers because they're the only thing that helps me to feel comfortable. And so then I'm starting to build a picture of this poor person with a fermenting gut, because that's what the bloating suggests, but also that they're constipated, and rarely they might have loose motions, but I would say I see constipation for the most part with my clients.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Me too, completely. And because I tend to specialize, I suppose, or gravitated to specialize in hypothyroidism and thyroid conditions and that whole endocrine hormone umbrella, I experience the same, but in reverse, if you like. So it's unpacking where the underlying cause lies, doesn't it really? So with classic sign of hypothyroidism is a slowing down of motility. So constipation is certainly one of those. So you used a term of fermenting and putrefaction of food, and this in our world is often described as a condition called dysbiosis or bacterial overgrowth. Could you maybe expand on that and explain what that actually means to our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. So dysbiosis just means disordered gut microbes, basically. Mm-hmm. So in such a way that they're not beneficial for the host. So we should have good mixture of different types of bacteria in the gut, a diverse group of bacteria that are able to ferment and putrefy all manner of different food particles that we consume. But what can happen is that factors in our personal history, our diet, our lifestyle, antibiotics, medications, etc., they have an influence on the balance of the flora that we have in our gut, and we can wind up with an imbalance, with the wrong mixture, if you like. And if we have too many of the more fermentative types of bacteria or too many of the sulfur reducing bacteria, the result can be lots of gassiness or lots of putrid smells, and also abdominal pain and cramping can be experienced as well. You mentioned SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and this is a form of dysbiosis as well. This is a frank overgrowth of bacteria in the upper gut, which ordinarily shouldn't have a big bacterial population, should be relatively speaking quite low in bacteria, because there should be enough secretions of things like stomach acid and digestive enzymes and bile that naturally act as disinfectants and keep bacterial levels down. But one of the predisposing factors to SIBO is when those secretions are not secreted at the right levels for various reasons, including hypothyroidism.
Yes, there is a real. So I see that a lot in that hypothyroid patients, their secretions are low because we need thyroid hormone to help the gallbladder to contract. So therefore we can end up with sluggish bile. And you've just beautifully articulated that we need bile as part of those digestive secretions. So that there is such a synergy with this. What other maybe lifestyle aspects would contribute to a dampening down of those secretions that then will leave somebody more vulnerable to be having that upper fermenting gut?
I would say stress.
Yes.
We're living through a endemic, for goodness sake. So our world has been turned upside down over the last 18 months. And I see a mixture of women who are homeschooling their children, which, I don't have my own children, but I'm given to understand that can be a bit of a stressful situation. But also, suddenly finding themselves being at home, having their husband at home, having their kids at home, trying to make sure the kids are doing everything that they're supposed to be doing, just trying to keep a lid on everything, keeping the family ticking over, and dealing with the stress around not being able to see loved ones, perhaps being a carer for a mum or a father, or not being able to see them. These have been strange times indeed. And I think we are all living with a heightened sense of stress because of that environment. And that's on top of everything else. So stresses take many forms. So stress like COVID, definitely. But equally, stress can be inside the body. So it can be a diet high in carbohydrates, can be inflammation, can be infection as well, can be toxicity, can be being too heavy. So being overweight would contribute here as well. And our favorite, blood sugar dysregulation, too many carbohydrates, not enough protein and fats, and basically blood sugar falling through the floor. So all of those things act as stressors and all contribute to increasing the stress load on the body.
And then to circle back round, what that does is it puts the digestive tract, or an aspect of the digestive tract, into a bit of a holding pattern. So motility slows down, and there's a lessening of those digestive secretions, which help to disinfectant the upper part of the gut.
Yeah, absolutely. The body becomes so stressed that you get stuck in a fight or flight mode. And if you can imagine this, if your body thinks it's in fight or flight, so it thinks you're going to stand and fight your corner or run away as fast as possible, then it doesn't think you're going to sit and eat your lunch in the middle of all of that. So it's not ready to help you to digest your meals. It's not secreting stomach acid and digestive enzymes in the way that would help to optimize digestion. And instead, what happens is you end up having a meal, and then the food just sits in your stomach. The stomach delays emptying. The food then starts to kind of fester and gas production. Then you start getting reflux, and then that promotes this kind of Sibo scenario and other types of dysbiosis as well. There's also a Candida Dysbiosis, which I'm sure your listeners will be well aware of too.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. And so with this stress, let's call it a stress load, which you've very beautifully described, and stress, again, to underpin that, can be mental and emotional, and it can be an infectious or bug burden. It can be dietary related. It could be having our circadian rhythm being switched completely off. All of these are stressors which puts the body in a semi-fight or flight mode, and that impacts the gut. I see a number of clients that are then, as they start to get these digestive symptoms, they start to try and eliminate a whole variety of different foods and sometimes entire food groups, which you and I have talked passionately about over the years. Where do you see, are there, and quite often ending up demonizing entire food groups, like the entire carbohydrate food group? Could you talk to that a little bit in terms of, are there particular types of foods or types of carbohydrates that you see being helpful to trial remove around specific symptoms? And we'll talk about histamine in a minute, but
yeah, sure,
lead into that.
Yeah, what can be very helpful is the avoidance of a group of foods that we call the Fodmaps Foods. So Fodmaps is an acronym. It stands for fermentable oligo disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. So those are all. Yeah, I've got that as a tattoo, actually.
Have you? I bet you.
Yeah. So these Fodmap foods, they have one thing in common. They're readily fermentable by bugs that live in the gut, by bacteria. And they are foods that they're a big part of our Western diet. And so they include things like, so fructose containing foods. So think apples, pears, watermelon, lactose. So that's dairy produce. So, custard and ice cream, those types of things. Lattes, we're very much a cafe culture. And then we've got the fructans, which takes into account onions and garlic and gluten, which is a big deal. And then we have the polyol family. So they include quite a lot of soft fruits. So think about things like nectarines, peaches, apricots, those types of things. Also mushrooms, cauliflower, They can all be problematic. Avocado can be problematic. And what's really weird about FODMAPs is that people often do worse when they're eating healthily. So I've had patients say to me, when I eat chicken and chips, I feel just fine. But when I'm making myself a fantastic salad that's got avocado and brown rice in it and sweet potato and I use lots of onions and garlic, then I'm running to the toilet and I'm so uncomfortable and I'm bloated for 3 days afterwards. And that's an absolute telltale sign that someone has got potentially Sibo, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and that basically bacteria have overgrown in the upper gut and they are making merry off of these fermentable carbohydrates in the person's diet.
Perfect. Brilliantly explained. Thank you. So one of the links that I have found, especially around women when they're either in a life stage of perimenopause, where there is more sort of it's a time in our lives where there is more erratically high estrogen, and progesterone is dropping, is the hormone that's dropping first.
Yeah.
There's this sort of exacerbation of particular cell or the release of this compound called histamine, which is in mast cells, which there is a real connection with Sibo and histamine, isn't there? Could you sort of talk, and actually just before you were recently, which I was so thrilled to see, on Channel 4's Food Unwrapped show, talking about the role that histamine plays. And I think a lot of women saw it and were like, oh my God, this is the magic. This is the final piece of the jigsaw. Could you talk a little bit firstly about what histamine is and where it comes from?
Sure. So histamine is a very important chemical in the body, a compound. It's used by the immune system, and particularly the mast cells of the immune system. And its job is to help to protect us against pathogens. So think about parasites predominantly, but also molds, other allergic triggers, certain types of food, for example. So it's a protective compound. And histamine itself is not a bad thing.
No.
But this condition called histamine intolerance is really what is described when an individual produces histamine but is then not able to degrade and break it down.
Mm-hmm.
And that's for a variety of reasons, but often there can be genetic mutations that we carry, particularly around our diamine oxidase gene, that makes diamine oxidase, which is an enzyme that helps to break down histamine inside the GI tract. And we can also have further gene mutations on other pathways involved with the clearance of histamine. And they include the HNMT pathway can be mutated, acetylation pathway, methylation pathway. We can also have challenges around the detoxification pathways as well. So as well as methylation, there's also the sulfation pathway and the glucuronidation pathway that are used to help to clear estrogens out of the body. And just kind of circling back to something that you said earlier on about this time of life, the perimenopause, which is the 8 to 10 years before a woman goes through the menopause, which is a state when a time of life when hormones become very imbalanced, and a woman can spend a large proportion of her time being estrogen dominant. And estrogen, there's an incredible interplay between estrogen, progesterone, and cortisol, and histamine. So basically they all influence each other. There's this huge connection between them all. But in simple terms, you've alluded to the fact that in estrogen dominance, estrogen is able to trigger mast cells to release histamine, and that's absolutely the case. And unfortunately, these women in the perimenopausal zone of their lives, they tend to be somewhat low in progesterone. And progesterone's main job is to oppose estrogen, but it also dampens down mast cell activity and helps to reduce histamine production.
Yep.
So, and then when you chuck cortisol into the mix as well, that also is pretty interesting, because the HPA hormonal response to stress results in mast cell degranulation, and subsequently further elevates histamine. So stress increases histamine production. And in the hypothalamus, which is the master gland, the H1 receptors for histamine and the estrogen receptors sit together. So estrogen can influence histamine production as well. And then histamine can also influence cortisol production by the effects on the adrenal glands.
Yes.
So you can, so then the adrenal glands are involved in trying to dampen down the histamine response, and it pumps out lots of cortisol, and cortisol's job is anti-inflammatory.
Yep.
But then in order to make cortisol, you have to make cortisol releasing hormone, and that activates mast cells to produce more histamine. So
horrible.
So the poor woman in this perimenopausal phase through to menopause can really feel quite not like herself. And she will be experiencing a myriad of strange symptoms that she's not had before.
Mm-hmm.
But to her way of thinking, mimic quite a lot of kind of PMS-y type symptoms, wanting to kill the nearest and dearest. Maybe also having things like headaches and migraines for the first time as well, which is very much associated with histamine as well. So it can be very, very challenging time of life. I know, I have just survived it. So yeah, I have a lot of empathy with these people that we see.
And I mean, that is just amazing. I'm sure there are so many listeners jumping up and down and sort of on the edge of their seat. And that's the point, is to educate and help our listeners find people like yourselves so that they can navigate this. So there are a couple of things that you mentioned there. So histamine receptors, there are many, but there are what we know at the moment, there are broadly 4 histamine receptors. So these can be in the brain, these can be in the gastrointestinal tract, these can be in the skin, in the uterus. So that's why there can be so many far-reaching signs and symptoms of a histamine overload.
That's right. And that's what makes it difficult for these ladies to get a diagnosis.
Yeah.
Because histamine affects just about every cell in the body.
Yeah.
Depending on the receptors that are clustered there.
Yeah. Because as you said, we need it. It's like a lot of all of our hormones, really. There's the Goldilocks hypothesis, which we need just the right amount, because there are physiological requirements for these hormones. But when anything is in excess or there's a deficiency, then we fall into muddy waters.
Yeah.
So you talked about the fact that we require this molecule, but we have an endogenous sort of built-in mechanism of being able to naturally clear this histamine through. Mm-hmm. So you talked about DAO, which is diamine oxidase, and this is predominantly, where is this predominantly located? This particular,
it's in the GI tract.
So if there is problems within the GI tract, i.e., if there is
inflammation, dysbiosis, and Sibo. Yeah, and Sibo, there's actually an extra mechanism at play with Sibo as well, because the Sibo bacteria cause a state of leaky gut. They damage the small intestinal lining, and it's these cells within the small intestine that create diamine oxidase. And then the Sibo bacteria themselves, they can make histamine from the foods that you eat.
So there are groups of bacteria that actually produce histamine as well.
Yeah.
Okay. And I know everyone is going to be saying, "Can you test for that? Can you test for that?" What is your view on how do you assess whether you feel that histamine is a component, a trigger for women, especially if it's really exacerbating their hormonal symptoms? Are there some particular telltale signs that you think, okay, I'm gonna zone in on this?
I take a very careful health history, to be honest. testing for histamine issues can be a bit problematic.
Mm-hmm.
So we can test for diamine oxidase production.
And how
we can also, and I do a reasonable amount of that. And I also am a big fan of LifeCode GX's histamine pathway test. The Amabesic, I'm a big fan of that. Yeah. And that's very helpful to understand if someone's abilities to make diamine oxidase is genetically predetermined, as well as everything else that is going on. Because one of the things that we can do when we work with clients is we can recommend supplements of diamine oxidase to help the breakdown of histamine in the GI tract, but they're only effective about 50% of the time.
Yeah.
And I think that probably has to do with where the histamine is being produced and whether it's actually outside of the GI tract and whether actually it's the HNMT pathway that needs support. Mm-hmm. But most of those histamine degradation pathways, they can be supported too with key nutrients, which include some of the key B vitamins and zinc. A lot of people with histamine intolerance are deficient in magnesium as well. So magnesium supplementation can be helpful. Quercetin as a mast cell stabilizer can be helpful. Nigella sativa can be helpful. Most kind of anti-inflammatory measures, ginger, curcumin, those types of things can also be very helpful in this regard.
Brilliant. Okay. And are there particular digestive symptoms that you would associate more with being histamine rather than another form of dysbiosis? Does there tend to be more of a presentation towards loose stools or constipation, or is that too simplistic?
No, not at all. I've found in my clinical experience that histamine intolerance is quite often accompanied with diarrhea, because histamine tends to speed up the gut transit time. Yeah. Of course, it depends what else is going on with the individual. If someone's got a Sibo methane, that has got the opposite effect where it slows down the gut transit time. You may not see loose motions. Instead, what you're looking at is, again, from a person's health history, you're looking at a history of maybe hay fever, allergic type reactions, urticaria, itching, rashes, strong reactions to insect bites, family history. So you're looking for atopic families, where you've got asthma, allergy, hay fever running in a family, then that might give you the picture. And sometimes it's in someone's anecdotes that they share with you. So they might say, I wanted to come and see you because I've got this terrible thing going on. The other night I went out, my friend had cooked a venison casserole and we had some red wine and it was wonderful. But then I spent all the next day in the toilet. And, the first thing I'm thinking of is, venison, slow cooked, red wine, histamine, toilet, diarrhea, so then I'm starting to be suspicious. And then you start to question around the area and you say, do you have hay fever? Have you ever had any kind of histamine type reactions? And then there's normally that opens up a whole discussion point, because then someone just says, yes, that's right. Oh gosh, I had wondered about that. Somebody else had said that to me. Oh yes, I do get that. And then you're well on your way, but I would say it's understanding what to look for, because, I've been in clinical practice for over 10 years. And I would say that probably for the first couple of years of practice, I didn't think I ever saw anyone with histamine. And now I think it's everybody. So I've gone completely the other way.
We do need to be, as we grow as practitioners, we sort of, it's about the lens that we're viewing and obviously there is the best intention every single client we see, but there, of course, as practitioners we grow and we learn as through our clients, and so it is looking through the lens. It's important for us to keep taking a step back and looking at the whole 360 and piecing together what is applicable in that individual at that time.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, I learn with every patient, that's for sure.
Yeah, for sure. It is a journey. I also wanted to ask your opinion. It's very common with women to have an exacerbation of their digestive symptoms, maybe around, or bowel habits around their period, or just on the lead up to their period. And certainly, so in women that are still cycling, that sort of breakdown of the uterine wall is in it itself releasing what we call prostaglandins. So they're sort of inflammatory inflammatory mediators. Do you have any other sort of insights into why women's digestive symptoms may become more exacerbated or more heightened at certain times if they're cycling?
Yeah, absolutely. What I see very often is constipation on the run up to a period. And I think that's because there's less estrogen in the last half of a woman's cycle and more progesterone. And progesterone tends to slow the bowel down.
Yes.
So that's what I would say. And I encourage the ladies that I work with to kind of manage that time of their cycle with a bit of magnesium citrate.
Perfect. Yep.
So that helps to kind of ease the bowels, and also will soften any cramping that they might experience as they start to lose their endometrium and they start their bleed.
Yes. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. And that bears true in that sort of in the second phase of perimenopause as well, because that progesterone, that ovulation is not, that lovely surge is not happening in the robust way. So there is a big difference between bridging a nutrient gap and supporting pathways to just continue habitually taking laxatives. It's a completely different approach, supporting it's bridging a gap, isn't it?
Absolutely, it is. It is also making sure that at this time of life that these ladies seek solutions for addressing things like constipation. And sometimes a stool test can provide a really important insight into other influences on hormones. And what I'm talking about here is the production of beta-glucuronidase by bacteria in the gut.
Brilliant. I was going to ask you.
Yeah, exactly. So beta-glucuronidase is an enzyme produced by bacteria in the gut. And basically what it does is it interferes with the glucuronidation, or the clearance of estrogens from our bodies.
Yeah.
So during the perimenopause, women tend to be more estrogenic anyway. So what you don't want your gut flora also contributing to the problem by making it even more difficult to clear estrogens out. So then, by doing a tactical stool test, which I find is always liked by my patients when they've actually managed to do the sample, of course, but they've always liked the analysis part and understanding themselves a bit. But there's a lot that can be done to support the clearance of hormones at this stage of your life. And it's dietary, so it's not all about taking pills, So working on estrogen clearance is about maintaining a healthy weight. So if you have been putting on a few pounds, it's understanding that our fat cells also contribute to making estrogen. So getting your weight in order is really helpful. And also from a diet perspective, eating less kind of white refined carbohydrates, eating more soluble fibers, provided that they're tolerated, provided there's not a Sibo situation going on. So helping the clearance of estrogens through the bowel, through the stool, really important. Eating cruciferous vegetables, particularly broccoli. I know you did a beautiful article about chopping broccoli and leaving it on the side to accumulate the active ingredient in there. So broccoli and sulfurous vegetables are really important for supporting another pathway that is involved in clearing estrogen as well. And then maybe getting something like a food form B complex to support methylation as well. So that's another key pathway that is involved in clearing estrogens out. All of those things, and magnesium, I would say, to manage the bowels and help with sleep and anxiety, are likely to help with this phase of life for an individual, make it a lot more survivable, I would say.
Brilliant. That's really fantastic. So if some of you have got a little bit overwhelmed with, because Tracey's just explained a really, really important component there. If I can maybe summarize that, especially some of you might be thinking, but as we come into menopause, don't we want more estrogen? What we're specifically talking about is very much in the perimenopause stage, where estrogen is more unopposed by the dropping off of progesterone. we can see more of an estrogen dominant type of situation. And there are particular bacteria in the gut, which are referred to as the estrobolome, which will produce this little enzyme called beta-glucuronidase, which actually helps to uncouple estrogen and recycle it. So it's sort of adding to that estrogenic pool, which, if it's unopposed by progesterone, can actually exacerbate some of these sort of perimenopausal symptoms. And so ensuring that there is a healthy sort of flow and bowel movement and making sure that we detoxify. So the words that Tracey was using, like glucuronidation and methylation, these are all just detox pathways that we can support through diet, lifestyle, and nutrition. And we can test for some of these higher beta-glucuronidase critters on a stool test. Is that kind of right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's quite a lot of techie speak. I apologize.
But we're here to try and distill it for you. So before we finish up, Tracey, I could talk to you all day, which I do generally, generally with a glass of wine in my hand, though. You talked about using sort of testing in your clinic at IBS. So you've alluded to the fact that there are stool tests where we can look at some of these. We can identify some of these more estrogenic bacteria, but there are also some bacteria that are more prone to producing histamine as well. We can pick those up on a stool test as well.
We can, yeah. There are a couple of critters that I am always interested to see. Hafnia alvi, Klebsiella, for example, they're known to encourage histaminosis, as we call it, so increase histamine.
And Morganella, is that one? Or
Morganella morgani is another one, actually. Yeah. We do the same thing.
So these can all be done on the same stool test, can
Absolutely. They? A stool test, like I said, once you get over the fact that you're doing a stool test, there's a wealth of information that is shown up by it that we use very much to help to modify an individual's diet and lifestyle to help them feel better.
Great. And then two other questions. I think we know that there is a specific Sibo test. So if you could talk to what that involves, and then are there any bacterial species on a stool test that might indicate that there might be sort of some form of Sibo fermentation in the upper gut?
Yeah, absolutely. So if an individual comes to me and I see this quite often, they might have worked with another practitioner and they've just done a stool test. Mm-hmm. So stool tests are, strictly speaking, not to be used for the diagnosis of Sibo, but there are some markers on there that are indicative of maybe a problem higher up in the gut. So you still need to test it.
Yeah.
So the points that I look at are very elevated short chain fatty acids. So sorry, that's a bit of technology, but short chain fatty acids are created by bacterial fermentation of food fiber. So if they're at very high levels, then you've got to think, is there an overgrowth of bacteria present here?
That makes sense.
So you might also see fat in the stool because Sibo bacteria can interfere with fat absorption and leave fat in the stool. So that's when you see it.
Yeah.
You can also see products of protein breakdown where digestion's not been great in the upper gut because of inflammation, and you might see protein particles. And then depending on the stool test, there are certain strains or families of or phylums of bacteria that can overgrow fairly strongly. So, and I'm thinking predominantly of the Bacteroides group of bacteria. Yeah. They tend to very strongly overgrow, and they tend to be the main inhabitants of Sibo as well, because the important point about Sibo is that the bacteria that overgrow there are not pathogens, they're colonic flora. So they normally are our friends, but they've just found themselves in the wrong part of the gut.
They're just in the wrong place.
They're just in the wrong place. And so they carry on doing what bacteria do. And ordinarily when they're in the colon, we're happy for them to do that. So
great. And then there is a Sibo test specifically.
Yeah, so there's quite a funky test called a hydrogen breath test. So in very simple terms, what happens is an individual does a special diet the day before, which is the most peculiar diet you'll ever do, which is basically rice and chicken and cheese and eggs and fat and not too much else. So nothing even vegetable-like, nothing with fiber in, but it's just for 24 hours. Then you fast overnight. And then you can begin the Sibo test the next day. And the Sibo test is basically blowing breath samples into little test tubes. You do an initial sample, then you drink a lactulose solution. Lactulose is a special sugar that is not readily absorbed by the human gut. We need bacteria help to break it down. So what it does is it's a provocation test, really, where we're deliberately feeding the bacteria with lactulose and hoping that they are going to do what bacteria do, ferment it and produce gases. And basically, by doing a breath sample every 20 minutes for 3 hours and collecting all the test tubes very carefully, we send the test tubes off to the lab for analysis, and the lab looks for presence of hydrogen and methane gases. And that will, and the arrival of these high levels of gases are what determines whether the bacterial overgrowth is present high up in the gut, in the small intestine, or whether it's actually in the large bowel.
Perfect. And these gases, guys, are really what produce a lot of the symptoms. So they either slow down the bowel or speed up the bowel. They cause a lot of visceral sensitivity, so they kind of touch nerves, and that's what's caused a lot of the abdominal pain. Yeah. And they can be responsible for other conditions such as rosacea, restless leg syndrome. So it is Tracey's clinic and the nutritionists that she has working with her are so across all of these interconnections that anyone that is trying to navigate whether their symptoms and whether their presentation is hormonal, it will always have a gastrointestinal component because the body is completely interconnected. So it's it's a fascinating area to be working in. Yeah. With that in mind, Tracey, is there a sort of a final piece of advice that you would be giving to a woman who is feeling that they are sort of being beholden to their hormones, and they're being backed into a bit of a corner, and they don't really know where to start in terms of in terms of them approaching this by looking at their overall gut health from top to bottom? Is there anything that you would, from the conversation that we've had, suggest that they consider from a digestive health perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing to say is don't suffer in silence. And despite perhaps the advice by well-intentioned GPs, this isn't your lot as a woman. You know, this isn't just what happens during the menopause or through the perimenopause and you've just got to put up with it. There is so much that can be done. And it doesn't have to cost a lot of money, and it doesn't have to be complicated. You are very much able to influence your health by what you put on your fork. You just need some assistance with understanding what that fork load should look like. You know, so there's a lot that can be done. You can experiment yourself, looking at Fodmaps, for example. There's a lot of Fodmap resources. There's a Monash University app for iPhone for £7.99. There are books on Amazon and other book retailers that describe the Fodmaps diet in a bit more detail. You could just try that for a few days, and you would know within a couple of days if you're on the right track. Mm-hmm. And then you're on your way to feeling a bit more comfortable. Yeah. And then have a think about, maybe contacting a health practitioner, maybe trial some of these very inexpensive things that we've described today, a bit of magnesium, some B vitamins, some zinc. From a histamine standpoint, it might be worth engaging with the GP for an official diagnosis of having a histamine issue. There are some medications that can be used alongside these natural solutions that Tanya and I have described. I like to try and be very practical and pragmatic with my patients. I have a number of patients that work with me who suffer with mast cell activation syndrome, which is kind of even more extreme than histamine intolerance. And these ladies do very well mixing up fexofenadine and sodium chromoglycate alongside my quercetin and my vitamin C, working on my low histamine diet, etc. It's a team effort. And because there's an inherent anxiety that feeds into all of this, because histamine is an excitatory neurotransmitter, so it can promote anxiety in people. So sometimes taking short-term a medication to calm anxiety down, or something like a mast cell stabilizer that the GP would be happy to help you with, can just give you that kind of breathing space to then be able to focus on looking at the bigger picture.
Perfect.
So that would be my advice.
Brilliant. Absolutely beautifully put and beautifully summed up. The whole MCAS thing is probably a whole other podcast, so we'll have to get you back.
Yeah, that's for another day.
That's for another day.
Yeah.
But the overview is that there are many tools in our kit bag and within this world. And Tracey, thank you so much. If people want to find you and your colleagues, they can look at ibsclinics.com.
www.ibsclinics.co.uk.
Yes. So you can find Tracey and her wonderful team there. Thank you so much. It's been just wonderful having you on, and I hope you'll come back and speak to us again. And thank you again to all the listeners. If you liked this podcast, please give us a thumbs up and give us a recommendation, and we will see you next time on The Best of Health.